I want to introduce Mr. Douglas Struble from Taylor, Michigan. He's a suburb of Detroit. And the topic is going to be astrophotography from a light polluted site, which is something all of us in the Metroplex know absolutely nothing about, since I think we can compete with Douglas. I think we're at portal 9, maybe 10 if they were off the scale. It's a problem, and it's a problem for visual astronomers too. I'm just going to turn it over to you right now, Doug, and see if we can share screen, and we'll go from there. So now, Douglas Struble from Taylor, Michigan, and it's all yours.
Hey, nice to meet all you guys. Like Ed mentioned, I wanted to talk about imaging from a light polluted area, and this is of course strictly astrophotography, not visual. It'd be pretty hopeless to do visual here. I guess I'll share my screen and getting started here. I kind of want to do a brief introduction real quick about how I got into this hobby, and what led me to where I was at. Everybody has an interesting story, I'm sure. And then once I get through this, we'll talk about astrophotography in a light polluted area, and then go into some questions and answers and whatnot, in order to help out people that might have some questions and moving forward with what they want to accomplish. So first of all, when I was a teenager, my uncle, Robert Nagy, got me really big into astronomy. He used to have an 8-inch Celestron SCT back in the 80s. When I was a teenager, or actually a kid, I used to write astronauts all the time, including the Apollo 11 crew, among others. And, I was born in '72, so this is well after, they originally landed on the moon. My uncle, Robert Nagy, was the one that really got me into astronomy when I was a kid, but I did not appreciate it back then as much as I do now, of course. And I really, over the past, I would say 15 years, wanted to get into astrophotography, and I kind of studied the way things were coming along with technological advancements and what we could do. Back in the day, you were left with film, and film was really hard to deal with. And over the past, I want to say maybe 10 years, I started, researching CMOS and CCD cameras, but I didn't really have the money to do what I feel do it justice. So I kind of never really got into it a whole lot, and I was kind of waiting until I saved up some money. And then something happened back in 2016, where a drunk driver totaled my Challenger SRT8 in my driveway, and I had it paid off quite a bit, and I got a check from State Farm, and I was like, as opposed to buying another hot rod, I think I was going to start building some equipment that would do astrophotography really well. So they say that every story begins with alcohol. That's good. In this particular case, it wasn't me. It was the driver that ended up totaling my car. So it was a pretty hot mess. And then the police were called out, whatever. But I do miss my car quite a bit. It was a lot of fun, but I will tell you what, doing astrophotography is a lot more rewarding and challenging than driving around a hot rod. And when I first started out, I started off with a Celestron SCT, in my backyard, and I would go to parks. You guys can hear me okay, right? Okay, cool. So I started out, in the backyard, kind of experimenting a little bit. I bought a Windows laptop computer to run some of the software, and I was doing some planetary work, at the very beginning. Back in 2000, it was the spring of 2016. I was doing some planetary work with Jupiter, Mars, and Saturn. I had some good results, but when you do planetary work, it kind of gets boring rather quick because there's only so many, solar system bodies to image. So I started getting into doing deep space, and I got a hyperstar for my Celestron, and a color camera. It was a ASI 1600 MC color camera, cool. And this is the very first image I did with deep space. This is M51. I know it's kind of hard to tell because it looks really bad, but and after time, I realized that going with a mono camera, especially with a heavily light polluted area, gives me a lot more control of each of the color channels. And 2 years later, I was able to do something like this right here of M51. So this is kind of where I'm at right here, in the Detroit area. And as you can see, where this sad face is here is where I'm located at. It's a Boral 8 white zone area, pretty much. I have a couple friends that image from this area too, and it can be done. It just requires a lot more integration time. It requires a lot more shorter exposures. Sometimes I get people that tell me, on Facebook, people that follow me or what have you, if you would do 15-minute exposures, you'd pull out a lot more information. Well, the problem being is that you overwhelm the sensor on the camera, and your histogram gets all debunked, it gets all messed up. So really what you need to do is a lot of short exposures and then integrate all those short exposures. It eats up a lot more hard drive space than you normally would, but that's pretty much the only way to do it without overwhelming the sensor on the astrophotography camera. So that's pretty much what I do. I do some narrowband. I try to avoid it at all possible. I try to go after, I do a lot of broadband, some broadband, but I try to go after narrowband as much as possible because it gives me a little bit more of an edge, being such a small sliver of the visual spectrum with all the light pollution here. And then in 2017, I realized that if I'm going to do a lot of exposure time, I need to make it easy, and I need to automate my system. So what I did was I built a slide-off roof observatory. I did some rough drawings of what I thought were a good design based off of several different other people's slide-off roofs that I found on the internet. And one thing that I realized was if I want to set up multiple rigs, a dome would not be a good fit for me because that's really good for one telescope, but if you want to run, two more or what have you telescopes, a slide off is a much better decision, and it can be more cost effective too. So in 2017, I started building a slide off in my backyard, and it wasn't really all that expensive, really. I laid the concrete. I hired a contractor to build what I was looking for based off the plans I drew up, and I think it was maybe $5,000, $6,000, or $7,000 at the end of the day. And then I ran electricity to it, via underground from my house. And then I had a problem with the trees in the backyard, so I talked to my neighbor in the south and to let me cut down some of the tree line down, but I I still only in the south can only get down to about M51, with the Pillars of Creation. That's about as far south as I can go. And then I built a permanent pier. I went to a local company that does a lot of metal work, and I designed a pier I was looking for, and they built it, and then they powder coated it for me. And then ultimately I ended up with this slide off observatory in my backyard. And this is like a couple shots over here. And this little shed thing next to it is where I keep a lot of other equipment that I'm not currently using. Inside the observatory itself, I have 2 rigs. I have my primary rig on an astrophysics Mach 1 mount that's built off the pier. And it has an Explorer Scientific 165 millimeter APO with FL35 glass. And it does really well. The focal length on it is 1155. So I'm able to capture a lot of smaller stuff. And then my second rig, which is the one in the back, is more mobile. I kept it mobile on purpose so I could like move it around or take it places. But I always have both rigs going at the same time, and I have 2 separate Windows laptops that are controlling each rig, and I monitor them from inside the house with TeamViewer with my Mac Pro. And it's another shot here at the home position. So in my studio, I have a studio. I do a lot of advertising production, but I'm able to supplement that with the work I do, on both systems, so I can monitor my integration over the night while I'm working on actual work, and then I'll monitor things on the one monitor here. So you'll see like I have a IP camera below both telescopes that kind of show me the clouds and the orientation of the telescopes. And then I have Sequence Generator Pro on both laptops running each rig. And then, from there, I've actually been able to produce a lot of good things given the amount of light pollution here, to the point where I'm featured in a lot of magazines like Sky and Telescope, Astronomy Magazine, and a magazine overseas called the BBC Sky at Night. And then with my second rig, I run a Stellar View, and I'm featured on there quite a lot with Stellar View of the Week. And I've actually won Stellar View of the Year for 2018 and 2019. I've tried to write some papers. One was for Explorer Scientific, talking about Planetary Nebula and how I go about trying to capture some of that. There's a link to that that I'll provide later. And then I did another article for Zoo cameras, because that's mostly what I use is Zoo cameras. And then so I kind of wanted to dive into some of my work here. Most of it, most of the stuff that I do well tends to be narrowband, just because of the amount of light pollution here. So when I'm doing narrowband here, I mostly try to concentrate on short exposure. So even with narrowband, I'm only doing 2-minute subs at about 200 gain, and with a 33 offset and negative 20 degrees Celsius. But I really pile on the data. So if you look down here, like this particular object was 36.4 hours between hydrogen alpha and oxygen, and able to, to pull that off. I guess that's kind of my niche. dealing with a larger APO, I've been trying to do more smaller planetary nebula, like the cat's eye. This was done with HA and oxygen. With a lot of times I'll add in like an hour each of RGB just to get some star color, to add some color to it. In this particular case, I had to do a different exposure time for the center because it was blown out otherwise. So I did oxygen and 120-second exposures, 2 minutes, and then 1 minute exposures at zero gain. So I guess at this time, like I said, I'd love to help out other people who live in a heavily light polluted area like I do. And if people have some questions, I would love to help them out. I guess at this point, if there's any questions that you guys might have.
Yeah, Doug, for folks that reach out to you, do you do that through your Facebook page? Is that the best way to contact you and say, hey, I'm doing this and what do you recommend? Or do you?
Yeah, I get a lot of messages on Facebook asking me, for advice on certain things. That's probably the best avenue. I also get some people on Astrobin. I do have an Astrobin account too that ask me some questions as well. So those are probably the two primary avenues for people to reach out in terms of questions or things I can possibly help them out with. Is there anybody out there that's been having problems with imaging with light pollution and perhaps needs some guidance or some help on some suggestions of what to do?
Do you talk about your processing? Is that possible?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, so it's interesting you should ask that. So, like, when I first started doing this, I really wanted to learn everything about PixInsight. So I do a lot of I do all my pre-processing in PixInsight. And then I used to try to do as much as possible post-processing in PixInsight too. But then I realized that Photoshop offers a lot more capability to finesse and to isolate certain things than PixInsight does. So I kind of reverted back to where I'm still doing most of my pre-processing in PixInsight, and I'll do some stuff like background extraction, and I'll do some MMT, but most of it I go back to Photoshop to really blend certain layers together, because that's a major problem with PixInsight is it doesn't deal with layers. It gives you less opportunity to do, to fudge certain things, with sharpening and whatnot. So I've kind of gone back to Photoshop in terms of post-processing a lot more than I was a couple of years ago.
Hey, I got a question for you.
Sure.
So, what's your method for picking your exposure times? You just trial and error, or are you measuring your subs and?
So yeah, which I've been using the ASI 1600 on both rigs for probably 3 or 4 years. At one point, I did some testing. I tested the signal to noise ratio on that camera, running 139 gain at 21 offset, and running 200 gain at 33 offset. And I found that my signal to noise ratio with narrowband was a lot better at 200 or at 2-minute subs with the 33 offset. So that's why I continue to use both with hydrogen, sulfur, and oxygen. I use 200 gain with a 33 offset. And I did buy a new camera recently. I bought a Zoo 183. I'm going to try it out on my 6.5-inch APO. It's going to bring me down to about 48 arc seconds per pixel, which is probably below my seeing level, but I'm going to try to give it a try anyways. If it doesn't work out, I'm going to switch it to my second rig, which is my 102 Stellar View, and I'm sure it would do fine there. But I'm just curious to see, because, you know, I keep doing smaller and smaller objects. You know, most everything in this universe, the objects are pretty small, you know, and I've been doing objects now that are down to 0.3 arc minutes. And when you're dealing with an APO at only 1155 millimeters of focal length, you know, it's not the greatest thing, but I'm able to finesse a lot of the processing, well, post-processing. I'll use stuff like StarNet to remove stars. I'll use something called Topaz AI sharpening. But there's like no one magic bullet. I have to like do a little bit here, a little bit there. Otherwise, it starts to look unnatural, or otherwise you start to pull out detail that isn't naturally there, which is something I try to avoid.
Thank
Do
you.
you have much? I'm sorry. I was going to ask if you have much opportunity to process dark nebula, or is that something
I tell you what. I'll show you my one attempt that I did on the LBN here. It was the Iris Nebula, and LBNs and a Boreal 8 or it's usually doesn't go very well. you don't get that natural brown look. You have to kind of fudge it. So let me pull up I did the Iris I think a couple of years ago. Where's it at here? And LBNs, I just try to avoid them. I mean, picking up dark nebula here is hopeless. Okay, well, here's one right here. I can't remember how old this one is. Yeah, so I mean, that's the Iris Nebula. You see some brown here. I mean, that's the brown wasn't naturally existing. I had to kind of fudge the data a little bit. There was another one I did that was even better, but yeah, LBN objects, dark nebula. It's something I can't really do here a whole lot. I did take my telescope up north once recently, like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and did the the Dark Shark Nebula, and it turned out rather well. But because of I own a media advertising company, I can't really get out a whole lot to go to star parties and whatnot. But this is one I did. Gosh, this is a long time. It's back in 2017 of the Dark Shark Nebula in darker skies. But yeah, LBNs, Dark Nebula, usually pretty much a no-go here.
Yeah, I wanted to encourage some of the new members or the people that have not tried or are thinking of trying astrophotography. We all know the frustration of observing from a light polluted site. That's why we have our dark sky sites. And if you can get out there, it's a great advantage. But, if you have questions for Douglas and you're just a little maybe intimidated or just not sure, what narrowband imaging means and what it is, please feel free to ask. And I was going to ask you, Doug. The narrowband can be real narrow or not so narrow. So I don't know.
That's good. That's a good question you bring up.
How narrow?
Yeah. So when it comes to doing narrowband, the lower the NM is, the better, especially with oxygen. So like on my one rig, I run Astrodon filters at 6 nm for sulfur and hydrogen, but with oxygen I run at 3 nm. And the reason why is because there's a lot of LED lights going up. And even on my second rig, I'll run, even though they're all astronomical filters, at 7 nm for hydrogen and sulfur, I run a 3 nm Astrodon, which has a different focal plane, so I have to adjust for that. But oxygen is always going to be the most effective one when it comes to light pollution. And getting a lower NM rating on an oxygen filter is, I think, to me, is paramount. Otherwise, you start getting some weird gradients and whatnot.
Hey, why are you going so wide with your sulfur? Was it cost, or is there something that you're including in there besides the sulfur band?
Sulfur band tends to be the weakest, so I don't have to worry about it so much.
Oh, so what do you like? You're picking up. You just got wider. You got a wider band, so you're picking up.
Yeah. So hydrogen, oxygen tend to be the strongest. Sulfur is tended to be the weakest if you're talking about the traditional Hubble Palette. So I'm not so concerned with the sulfur because it's a very weak signal to begin with, and I'm able to if I do have a gradient problem, which is I usually don't with sulfur, like I do hydrogen. It usually is not much of a problem. So usually those two bands I don't have to worry about so much. It's the oxygen band that's usually the major consideration.
So you're not so worried about light pollution getting in your sulfur, getting through your sulfur transmission?
Yeah, I don't have much of a problem with sulfur and hydrogen. Just a really light background extraction will resolve that, and I'll look at what it took out, and it's a very light gradient. It's not much. The oxygen one is the one is a lot more affected by light pollution.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I had a question on the aesthetics. Since you're shooting with a black and white camera, all your images, of course, are black and white. And the Hubble palette is a famous palette for assigning colors to the different channels. Do you generally stick with the Hubble palette, or do you use artistic license, or how do you decide on the aesthetics of what your color balancing and assigning the colors to your different channels?
So that's a good question. When it comes to Planetary Nebula, most of what you see in a Planetary Nebula is hydrogen and oxygen. You don't see any sulfur in a Planetary Nebula normally. So when the white dwarf collapses, obviously it doesn't turn into a nova. It blows out a lot of oxygen and hydrogen, and that's mostly what you get. When you get into some of these other nebula, like the Pac-Man Nebula, like the one you're seeing here, you're dealing with a lot of sulfur in there too. So that is usually what determines what I'm going to particularly do and what kind of palette I'm gonna focus on. So Planetary Nebula, hydrogen, oxygen. I'll do RGB stars to give us some color. When it comes to some of these other nebula, like the Pac-Man and what have you. I'll do I'll do usually a full Hubble palette or shell palette, and then sometimes I'll go back and I'll do like a bicolor palette and a hydrogen oxygen, which tends to be a little bit more natural. So like this one right here, this is Sharpless 96. It's a giant supernova nebula. This isn't the whole nebula itself. This is just the most prominent area where there's a certain knot on the nova that was the most interesting part, and that's what I'll focus on. But you need to do your research in terms of what's going to work out with sulfur. But for just as a note, Planetary Nebula, no sulfur. Just stick with the hydrogen alpha and oxygen. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Got a quick question for you, Doug.
Sure.
I know that you switched from your 152 Explorer Scientific to the 165, one being the FCD1 glass, the other one being the FPL53.
Correct.
I was wondering if you noticed any difference in the picture quality or the color arrangement within, switching from the FCD1 to the FPL53.
It's funny you should ask. Someone else asked me that recently, a couple months ago, and I think given my seeing conditions with my skies, I haven't really noticed much of a difference. One problem I was having was when I was doing RGB stars with some of these planetary nebulas, sometimes I would shoot low in the horizon. And the problem when you do that is that you're finding a lot of atmospheric distortion, just like you would if you were shooting a planet low. So what I started doing was I started shooting my RGB data for the stars closer to zenith, and you're fighting a lot more or less atmospheric distortion. And what was happening was I was getting stars that would color shift to magenta or green, and it was a major problem. I mean, I still get that while I'm here, but it's less a problem at zenith. So to answer your question, I haven't really noticed a huge difference between the two levels of glass. What I wanted was a little bit more aperture and about the same focal length. And to be honest with you, I'm friends with Scott Roberts over at Explorer Scientific, and he gave me a hell of a deal on the 165. And that's why I upgraded from the 152. I think that the glass quality, you're going to benefit more in a darker area. If I were to guess, maybe a Borel sky scale of 5 or less, you would start to see more of a difference. But that's been my experience with it.
Yeah, I have a question. Since you're doing a lot of small objects, planetary nebula, and you're working at, well, you said 1150 millimeters of focal length, something
Yes.
of that order. Had you considered going to like a Ritchie Chrétien or a Schmidt-Cassegrain to get upwards of 1,500 to 2,000 millimeters, or is the issue there just how fast the instrument is? It's going to be too slow, or tracking?
Actually, it's really neither one of those things. The problem I have here, so like this is an object I did recently, NGC 6058. This thing's 0.38 by 0.2 arc minutes. The problem being with when you're dealing with any mirror-based telescope, whether it's a Newtonian an SCT or an RC, you run into a lot more problems in a light polluted area where the light pollution starts to leak into the system. Like, you know, I had a 12-inch truss Newtonian with a shroud, and even though I had a shroud, the light pollution was leaking in and overwhelming the telescope at certain points when it was pointed at a certain point of the sky. When it came to an RC, you run into problems where if it is not exactly at the same focusing point, then when you do flats, it starts to look like a weird beveled donut. So running a mirrored-based telescope system in a heavy light polluted area is a lot less forgiving because of all the light leaks everywhere. So because of that, I've stuck with APOs, and I've tried a 10-inch RC, I tried a 12-inch Newtonian at f4, and of course my original telescope was an SCT, and you get a lot of problems. And then once you go below like 40 degrees in any direction around the horizon, the mirrored based telescope starts to get flooded with a lot more light pollution, and your subs are almost unusable, where I can go down with an APO down to 20 degrees and my ADUs will rise a little bit, but they're still usable.
No, that's good information for folks that are going to be city-based, and what kind of system to be, looking at if you're trying to do this type of work.
Yeah, I mean, it's tragic because like a good, high focal length APO is really expensive for most people. I mean, I happen to get a really good deal because of some of my notoriety with some of my work, and then Scott Roberts gave me a really good deal I couldn't refuse. Normally that 165 is around 13,000. I got it for.
Oh, Roger says a price. Go.
What's that?
What do you do, or how do you handle processing when you have lots of space junk, Starlink or other satellites coming into the images that that can cause problems? How do you go about? Do you just delete those, or do you use a special stacking software like Sequitur that allows you to process those images? What's your process there?
So I'm guessing by that question that you don't use PixInsight?
No, I use Photoshop, and I use some of the other software, but I do not know PixInsight at all.
So PixInsight, I don't know about some other ones, but they do pixel rejection. So when it comes to star trails, or when it comes to satellites, or when it comes to a freaking 747 going through your frames, it deletes that information. I know there's other ones out there like Deep Sky Stacker. I don't know if it has rejection algorithms with it or not, but PixInsight's rejection algorithms are very good. Elon Musk can throw up 50 more rockets full of satellites, and I'm not going to have a problem. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Deep Sky Stacker, which is the one I've been using, does not have that capability. Okay. But Sequitur, which I've recently discovered, does. So I've been trying to incorporate that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, those rejection algorithms are very important, not only from things flying into your frame, but when it comes to like hot pixels, for example. CMOS cameras will throw out a lot of hot pixels. It will reject some of that stuff too. So it just it does a really good job. I know it's kind of pricey. It's like $300 some odd, and this is just a freaking hobby that we're not going to ever make any money off of. But it's definitely a headache saver, especially with pre-processing.
Do you have a YouTube channel that you occasionally provide tutorials? I've seen you appear on Chuck's Astrophotography. I believe he's one of your neighbors in Detroit. He's got a regular YouTube channel.
He sure is. Yeah, he's done a lot of tutorials. I unfortunately run an advertising production company. I don't have a lot of time to do tutorials. My buddy Chuck, he's kind of retired, so he has a little bit more time on his hands to do those sort of things. I would love to retire and just do astrophotography, but that's not happening anytime soon.
Yeah, I just got a message, and Chris just posted a message that Chuck is watching you, Doug. So you make sure that you don't diss him or anything like that.
Oh no, I love Chuck. Me and him started out at the same time. We both started out in 2016, and we've grown together with this hobby a lot. And we've had many phone calls crying on each other's shoulders.
So, well, you know, I was kidding, but
he's a great guy, and he's a great astrophotographer. And we've both struggled dealing with some of the same things that we do here. I guess maybe the past couple of years we kind of focused on different objects that we shoot. Yeah, he's a great guy.
Okay. Any more questions? And again, folks that are new to astronomy, Doug has some fantastic photos. This is on his AstroBin site. I don't know if you can go back and put the address on the AstroBin. Chris is telling me I don't have any questions from YouTube, so that's. But don't be afraid to ask. We have the privilege of having somebody on that does this at a high level. So take the opportunity if you have a question.
The biggest. Oh, go ahead.
It sounds like you've never tried one-shot color. You're strictly a monochrome camera guy.
I did one-shot color for a few months in the very beginning, back in 2016, and I realized, due to my light pollution, it gave me less control over how I process each channel. And when you're dealing with this amount of light pollution, it's imperative that you have control over each channel, and that's why I've been using mono since. The biggest takeaway, if I were to say anything, is patience. You need to set up your telescope and just let it go. Some of these images I'll spend a month on. There's been times where in the spring, where it's a very rainy season here, I've spent a couple months just gathering integration time, and you just let it go. And you have other hobbies, you have other interests, or maybe you work at night, which is kind of what I do a lot, and you just focus on that and just kind of let it go and monitor it from here to there, and patience. That's all. I mean, that's the biggest thing.
Thanks.
Yeah, I had one final question to get around the light pollution. Have you considered remote gathering data remotely from remote telescopes?
I'm glad you asked that, actually. I've had many opportunities to do remote. I've had some opportunities to send my equipment places or to rent time on telescopes for a discounted rate. And as funny as this is going to sound, I love the challenge of saying, yeah, I pulled this out from near Detroit. And I love being able to say that. I mean, when I'm in a particular magazine or whatever, I don't think they give two hoots, where it came from. But me personally, I love saying that I've been able to do this where I'm at.
All right. Well, greatly appreciate your time and putting the presentation together. I'm going to ask one more time. I thought I heard somebody come on. Are there any other questions? Let me check the chat. Magnificent work from Bill. No questions from YouTube. So at that point, you're welcome to stay on. It's going to be just our business meeting, but at that point, we'll turn it back over to Michelle and to the rest of the club meeting.
Sounds good.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
You take care.
All right. Thank you very much for that presentation. It was fantastic.